A cop slaps two veterans. An hour later, a Marine walks into the restaurant. Don't forget to comment what country you're watching from. It all began in a typical roadside diner where two African American veterans, James and Walter, were having their coffee, just as they had every week for years. They wore their military caps with pride, remembering the days they served their country with bravery. But that morning, something changed. A local police officer walked into the diner and approached them with a look of contempt that made everyone present uncomfortable. For no apparent reason, he asked them for identification. James, his voice calm but firm, lied. "Officer, we're just having coffee. We're Marine Corps veterans." The answer didn't seem to sit well with him. "Veterans? You?" the officer said with a laugh, looking around as if seeking approval from the other customers. Some looked down, uncomfortable, while others watched in silence. "Black heroes don't exist," he exclaimed mockingly before stepping closer to the table. James tried to keep his composure, but Walter was already clenching his fists under the table. The officer took another step and shoved James lightly on the shoulder. "Show me proof you're not an imposter," he demanded. With difficulty, James pulled out his old, wrinkled military ID. The officer glanced at it with disdain and threw it on the floor. The silence in the diner was deafening. No one intervened. Some customers whispered among themselves, but no one dared to say a word. The officer, feeling powerful, raised his hand and slapped James, who barely managed to stay on his feet. Walter instinctively stood up, but he was shoved back into his seat with a blow to the chest. "Sit down, old man. You're not at war now. I'm in charge here." James could hardly believe what was happening, not for his own sake, but because of the cowardly silence surrounding him. Was it possible that after everything they had given for their country, they could be treated like trash? The diner's manager nervously approached. "Officer, please, we don't want any trouble," but he cut her off with a wave of his hand. "Trouble? These two are the trouble. They come in here acting like patriots when they can barely spell their own names." James felt something inside him break. It wasn't the slap or the humiliation. It was the pain of seeing decades of service reduced to nothing by the prejudice of a man with the uniform and power. Walter was breathing heavily, holding back tears. "We defended men like you," he muttered. But the officer didn't stop. He took James's coffee cup and smashed it on the floor, shattering it into pieces. Then he yelled, "Get out of here before I arrest you for contempt." James looked at him with a mixture of dignity and sadness in his eyes. Walter tried to help him to his feet. Just then, an elderly woman stood up from another table and said in a trembling voice, "I was in the '68 protests, and what I'm seeing now is just as shameful." The officer turned to her. "Sit down, you crazy old woman." James and Walter tried to walk toward the exit with difficulty. No one helped them. Some customers looked out the window, pretending not to see. Others pulled out their phones, but no one was recording. They just murmured. When they reached the door, the officer yelled one last time, "And don't come back. This place isn't for you." Walter paused for a second and turned his head. "This country wasn't for us either, and we still gave our lives for it." If you're enjoying the story, don't forget to like, subscribe, and comment on what you think, because what happened next, no one in that diner would ever forget. Just as the two veterans were staggering out, reeling from the humiliation they had suffered, a tall man in a Marine dress uniform walked through the main door. His presence commanded immediate respect. Everyone turned to look at him. The officer didn't recognize him at first, but his life was about to change forever. The Marine who had just entered paused for a second in the doorway. His gaze swept from James's injured face to the look of humiliation on Walter's. Then his eyes locked onto the police officer, who was still holding a defiant posture, unaware of what was coming. He was Captain Andrew Collins, a decorated, active-duty veteran who had served in the toughest missions of the Marine Corps. He carried the firm posture of a man who knows discipline, but a controlled fury smoldered in his eyes. He took 3 steps forward, the sound of his boots echoing like a silent judgment. The officer tried to appear confident. "What are you looking at, soldier boy? This is none of your business." Collins didn't answer. He just moved closer until he was standing barely a hand's breadth away from him. "Stand down immediately," he ordered, his voice firm. The officer laughed nervously. "Excuse me, you're giving me orders, dressed up in your finest like this is a parade?" But the Marine didn't flinch. He simply pulled out his military identification, displayed it with authority, and said, "You just assaulted 2 war veterans. Officer, anything you say from this point on can be used against you." In that instant, the diner filled with murmurs. The customers who had previously looked away were now pulling out their phones. The scene was starting to take on a new shape, but the officer, blinded by ego and rage, tried to assert himself. He shoved Collins with his shoulder and yelled, "I'm the law here, and you're just an actor with cheap medals." The Marine didn't move an inch. His face remained firm, but his gaze hardened. "I earned this uniform watching my men die in Iraq, while you were probably hiding behind a desk with a rusty pistol." The silence was brutal. The words felt like a shot to the officer's ego, who recoiled but still refused to back down. James, from the doorway, could hardly believe that someone was finally standing up to the man who had humiliated them. Then, something unexpected happened. Walter collapsed. The stress, the shame, and his age had taken their toll. He fell to the floor, and James knelt beside him, shouting his name. Some customers got up to help, but it was Collins who reacted with speed. He knelt beside the veteran, supported his head, giving clear instructions while asking someone to call an ambulance. The officer took a step back, now visibly shaken. "This wasn't my fault," he muttered, but no one was listening to him anymore. Everyone was focused on Walter, whose breathing was shallow. Just then, a young nurse who had been sitting at a back table rushed over to help. Collins let her take over and stood up, turning to the officer, now with no trace of respect in his voice. "You know what the worst part is," he said, his voice heavy with disappointment, "that people like you use the uniform as an excuse for abuse, while men like them wore it to protect this country. You are a disgrace to any force." The officer looked down. There were no more applause, no laughter, implicity, only judgment, only truth. The diner's manager approached and firmly asked the officer to leave the premises immediately. Minutes later, the paramedics arrived. Walter was stabilized and taken to the hospital, accompanied by James and Collins. On the way, Collins took James's hand. "I won't let this stand. I swear it," and he kept his word. The next day, the incident was all over the local news, thanks to the videos recorded by witnesses. The officer was suspended, and an internal investigation was opened for misconduct and abuse of authority. The police department issued a public apology to the veterans, but the most impactful thing happened at the diner the following week. The customers organized a tribute for James and Walter. The community gathered to honor them as true heroes. Collins was the one who spoke. "Today, we honor 2 men who not only served their country with honor, but who also demonstrated a dignity that many have now forgotten." James, with tears in his eyes, received a symbolic medal from the community, while Walter, still recovering, watched via video call with a smile that summed up decades of struggle. They were no longer alone. The truth had come to light. That day, the diner installed a permanent plaque on the main wall that read, "2 heroes had breakfast here. They will never be forgotten." The owner of the establishment, who had been absent on the day of the incident, apologized in person and promised to offer free breakfast for life to all veterans. James shook his hand and said, "We don't want pity, just respect. That's all we're asking for from the beginning." The room erupted in applause. "You never know who is behind the mask."